Hey you guys, I need to provide a trigger warning for this. There is blood, gore, along with other very disturbing scenes, so yeah, if you want to, click away. Otherwise, enjoy. Tonight was worse than all the other nights that she had yet to experience. The stench of tobacco, alcohol, and something pungent filled the walls of the home. Lily sat in the corner of her dark room with her door shut as she listened to the screams of her parents, followed by thumps, thuds, and the occasional crashing sound and glass shattering. It was nothing new. This happened often, if not every night. However, tonight was different. It felt different. The aggression and vehemence floating through the air that normally made the room stagnant were now smothering. Though the screams and the curses remained the same, something within the words caused a fear deep in her heart, giving her the urge to run. She had to get away from it. She could not bear another night of this. It must end now. As she stared down at her little worn shoes that were nearly covered by the pants that were 2 sizes too big, she considered what to do. Peering around, she grabbed her school backpack and shoved several items inside that she thought she might need and could not leave behind, along with a little stone she had recently acquired that kind of looked like a bear. There was not much that was left in her room but her bed and the larger furniture. Once the packing was done, she slung it over her shoulder and peered one last time at her closed bedroom door. Shadows moved about below the crack of the door, followed by more shouts. Placing her tiny hands over her ears, she grimaced and shook her head with dismay. She tried to talk to her mother that very day before her father came home, but it was just no use. Her mother lay asleep on the couch with her mouth hung open and a medicine bottle off to the side with pills astray. She would not wake to listen, and Lily could not understand how anyone could sleep that deeply and not at least so much as a stir. Well, her mom was on her own now. That was not the only time Lily tried to convince her mom it was time to go, but most of the time when Lily was home from school, her mom was out like a light. Her mother was the only one who did not discipline her with black and blue. Lily raised her window, jumped through the tall grass below, and walked off towards the woods behind the house. She had played in the backyard many times, but she had yet to venture into the wooded area. She knew not what lay behind the dark and tall trunks. The scent of pine and leaves grew stronger as she approached. Through the hay-like blades swaying in the cool night breeze, she tread on as she made her way into the edge of darkness before stopping to gaze at it and all that it seemed to hide and offer. She glanced around one last time at the house, where the dull glow shed through the living room window. The shouts and screams could still be heard, even at a distance. She peered down at her feet as her heart sank, then ventured onward into the unknown. What she planned on doing from here on out, she knew not. Her feet only moved further the distance between the toxic life she had been living until the sounds carried no further. Glancing up through the thicket, she noticed the moon had reached the sky up above. It must be midnight, she thought. As her eyes grew heavy, she pulled a blanket from her bag and crawled into an area where a small cave lay. The inside was dark but appeared to be around 10 feet deep. Curling up at the very back and lying her head down on the cold ground, she knew that they would still likely not realize that she was gone. The thought made her feel like crying, but she had learned to keep those to herself. As she closed her tired eyes, she heard rustling nearby. Her eyes sprang wide open as she stared through the small cave at the only entrance and exit, noticing that the wind was not blowing. Something was out there, close by. Fear crept inside of her, but it was a different kind of fear than what she felt back in her home. This fear felt like something new, something she had not yet experienced before and was unsure how to react to it. She lay still and watched the entrance of the cave as she waited for the unknown to reveal itself. If she were to cease this night, then so be it. There was no such thing as happiness, such as in the books they had at school. This was what they called fairy tales. They're not real. As her eyes adjusted to the blackness outside, she waited patiently, hearing the rustling growing closer. 2 white, glowing spheres appeared at the entrance of the cave suddenly, as if they hadn't even been moving, but just came into view out of nowhere. The silhouette of a person appeared around the glowing orbs that seemed to stare directly into her. She remained on the ground as still as a mouse in the sight of danger while staring at the orbs. The shadow tilted its head to the side and blinked once.
"Little one,"
a deep, soothing voice spoke.
"why are you hiding?"
She stared at the shadow and said nothing. It was something within her instincts from back home that told her as though to act as she could not speak in the face of danger.
"You mustn't be afraid. I have no intentions of thrashing discipline,"
it said. Her eyes somehow grew wider. Though she did not say it out loud, it was as if it had heard her. The shadow came into view and knelt down at the entrance of the cave as a smile spread across its face. It seemed genuine enough that some of the fear subsided while instincts clung close to what remained. Though she was not supposed to talk to strangers, this shadow did not feel like a stranger, but familiar. It felt familiar.
"I have seen you from afar,"
it continued on.
"You have lived a life of unhappiness for quite some time, little one."
She still had not yet moved, but glanced down at her hands that she had in front of her, where she lay on her arms for a pillow. Her hands still bore cuts and bruises from last time she had misbehaved and visited the memories that belonged to those words.
"Yes, I watched it when it happened,"
it said in a melodious proclamation. "Why?" she softly whispered. It felt strange speaking these days. There were periods where she would go days without speaking, and it felt strange to make a sound and hear her own voice.
"You would not let me in, little one,"
it stated. "What do you mean?"
"I have been since the dawn of your existence. You are a child of the night, and I am your guardian, but each time I attempted to save you, you rejected me."
She thought back to all the nights that were at its worst and recalled feeling something with her, but never seeing or hearing anything but the tangible that was happening around her. However, she never recalled rejecting anything that was trying to save her. Searching her mind for such a time, it spoke again, interrupting her thoughts.
"Don't worry,"
it said, almost as if it felt her searching around for the answer.
"I can give you everything you've been dreaming of, little one. Just let me in."
"Just let me in," she repeated to herself. She felt like she had heard this before. Not from her parents or other loved ones, but from someone else, or from something else. She sat upright in the cave with just enough room for her head to barely graze the rocky ceiling as she peered up only briefly, then back down to the watchful eyes. Then she recalled a story she had read about vampires, how they could not enter someone's home unless they were invited in willingly by the resident.
"I am not a vampire, child,"
it smiled through its comforting sound, a sound that seemed to crawl inside of her and make her at peace, though something felt off. "If you're not a vampire, are you my guardian angel?" she asked.
"I am."
"I've never heard of an angel as dark as you, sir," she whispered. "I cannot even see you well. I thought angels were bright."
"Not all angels look the same, love. Some of us are angels of light."
She felt like she had recalled something from the statement also. Church, perhaps? Her mother would send her on the church bus each Sunday. The Sunday school teacher mentioned angels of light, but little Lily could not remember much else from the lesson. With a frown of disappointment, she knew that her Sunday teacher would be unhappy with her forgetting such an important lesson. If she returned to church, she would need to make sure she was reminded to ask again. Since she could not quite recall what she was taught, the fact that the angel's statement felt contradicting. She was compelled to question him. "I'm sorry, sir, but if you're an angel of light, why do you appear so dark?"
"Names can mean something different than what they sound like your name.
It beamed.
You are a human named Lily, but it is also a beautiful flower that resides in a pond."
Lily was feeling more comfortable than she felt safe, but it seemed like her body could not stop her from relaxing further. This alarmed her, but it was difficult to fight off the sensations that felt good to finally relax for once. She did not have to be on high alert as she always was. Or did she? She continued to ask herself if this was actually safe, and what if she was feeling was close to being correct? Or even at all. The thought of her father came to her mind.
He had once fooled her into thinking that he was kind. He had been away for a long time. Her mother told her that he was away at the doctor to get better. That same day he came home, he had taken Lily out and bought her several toys to go get ice cream and to do whatever she pleased. However, on the way home, he stopped at the store that she was most afraid of. The store sold plastic and glass bottles of liquid rage, or anger as like she called it. He brought a large glass bottle of anger out with him in a brown paper bag and sat down in the front seat with her. He opened the bottle while still in the brown bag and took several large gulps from it trickling down his chin. Too afraid to say anything, she fell completely silent and knew that she must be on her best behavior. When they pulled into the driveway, he had turned back into the old dad that she knew.
"Get out of the car!"
He shouted as he pulled his keys from the ignition and slammed the door hard enough to rock the vehicle. Lily unbuckled quickly, but not quick enough, as he was already standing on the passenger side fuming that her door was still locked. He jerked on the handle, but the door remained shut as he started to shout.
"Open the goddamn door, Lily!"
he bellowed. As she pulled the seatbelt from her torso, she unlocked the door. The lock made a small click. It was already being torn from her hand as the door flung open. He staggered back from the sudden change, and this only furthered his rage.
"You disobedient little brat!"
he spat. He stormed to the car and took her by her long hair, yanking her from the seat. She fell to the gravel driveway, cutting her knees and palms as she let out a whimper. But she knew better than to cry out. If she were to do so, he would give her a well-deserved beating for such an atrocity. Taking her by her hair again, he pulled her from the ground and drug her inside as she scraped her knees along the way. Reaching the door, he shoved the door as it went through the hole that had already been in the wall for many previous occasions, such as this. Blood from her knees trailed into the house and on the carpet. Gripping her hair firmly, he slung her away from the door, causing her to fall to the floor. As she skid, she received a helping of a carpet burn on top of her already aching skin. And though the pain was immense, she struggled to keep her silence. But she could not keep it for long. Fear and pain rose higher as her stomach protested, but she knew then that it was hopeless. The sting rose to the point that the sherbet she had finally gotten was spewing onto the carpet and her dress. But there was no time to hide it. The mess was made. He had watched it all happen. His eyes flashed with rage when she turned to face him, lying on the floor in her own filth as tears streamed down her face. But she could not seem to stop messing up. She was selfish, bratty, and disobedient, and now she was crying, which was one of the worst evils. Yet she furthered her situation by vomiting on the carpet instead of the toilet. Whether she could make it to the toilet or not, this did not change the fact that it still happened. And if she were not covered in bile, he would have surely slapped her across the face, but thankfully it was dripping from her pale lips. However, it was not all over her body, just the front. He grabbed her hair again as well as her dress in the back, lifted her from the floor and threw her into the bathtub. Her head hit the acrylic with a loud bang and slumped to the bottom of the tub. As she was leaning her head up, he came storming in towards her, cutting on the cold water. The freezing water stung her skin as he pulled the knob to turn it from the faucet to the shower head. The acid on her skin had already begun to burn as the chill covered the rest, causing her to shake vigorously. She stared to heave again, but nothing came. Over the sound of the shower head, she could hear shouts from the living room of how disgusting the house always was. Her father then moved to talking about her pillhead mother being a lazy cunt, whatever that was, and the disrespectful and unloving family he took care of. The rest was incoherent, thankfully. Once the shouting had ceased and she was cleansed of her filth, she cut the water off. Quietly, she wrapped a towel around her. To be on the safe side, she got down on her hands and knees to see if he was waiting outside the door, but there was nothing. She rose and opened the door silently as she made her way to her bedroom. Glancing around for witnesses, she noticed her mother passed out on the floor. Foam slowly came bubbling from her mouth. Her father was on top of her naked mother, moving unevenly back and forth. He had not yet noticed Lily, so she tiptoed to her room and shut the door carefully. Closing her eyes to hold back the tears, she felt around until she locked the door behind her. After getting dressed, she remained in her room with the door locked for the rest of the day. Though she wanted to go retrieve her toys from the car when her dad was someone else, she knew better than to try that. If she were caught, she would be punished far greater than she had today. She was thankful she was not given a thrashing due to her vomit earlier. So she sat in her closet with the door shut, and the same for her bedroom door, as she heard screams and shouts begin later that night, as they did each and every night until sleep took over her. Returning back to the cave in the present with the Angel of Light, as he called himself, his glowing eyes peered at her on his dark and smiling face. She felt she must be careful because everyone she felt safe around would surely turn on her just as her parents had. Though this was what she thought was a stranger, he claimed that he had known her and that she should know him. Though he said he was her guardian angel, she felt she had never seen him before. He said he had always been there, but she had rejected his attempts to save her. She did not feel this was quite right, but then she thought of how everyone always called her stupid. If her parents thought she was, then she must be. Perhaps she is not to trust her guardian for once, if he really had appeared in the past. Or maybe she should. Now, out of all the other times, was better than never, right?
Everything you've ever wanted, the magic stories that you've been told, I can make this all happen for you, Lily.
It seemed to sing rather than speak in its harmonious, heavy tone.
You'll be safe under my control.
He had crept to the very edge of the cave entrance, but did not enter as he waited patiently for little Lily to emerge.
Just let me in.
Just let me in. Just let me in. Just let me in. Just let me in. Just let me in. Just let me in.
Lily felt her eyes growing tired. She could not keep them open as sleep began to take her over. The following morning, she woke to birds singing from outside of her little hole in the cave. As she raised her head, she saw a cute young boy at the cave entrance smiling her way. He was motioning for her to come out. She glanced around and saw the cave was the same, but behind the boy, the woods were much different than in the darkness. In the daylight, the woods had more color than she ever dreamed it would. Excitement washed over her as she sat right up and lunged forward before stopping herself in her tracks. Her instincts were coming back, telling her that this type of excitement was not allowed and she needs to remain calm. Looking down at her little hands that were planted on the ground, she noticed that her wounds were gone. How long had she been in the cave? Surely just one night, right? Thinking how funny this seemed, she looked ahead of her to see the gorgeous boy with vivid green eyes staring back at her with a smile that made her insides melt. Returning his smile, she crawled onward until she reached the entrance of the cave, leaving her bag and blanket behind. She emerged from the cave with her big blue eyes wide with wonder as she gazed around at the vibrant forest with their brilliantly painted leaves and trunks that seemed to be more alive. An assortment of pink budding flowers poured from the limbs of the trees, some of which had yellow, while others had blue, purple, and a plethora more. Glancing back at the dark, depressing cave, she removed her eyes from it and peered around at the marvel that filled her senses. Furry little squirrels, rabbits, and other tiny woodland creatures scurried while the birds swooped down to retrieve plump red berries from vines of the magnificent bushes. Up ahead, she could see that there was a clearing where it appeared that the air sparkled with life. Turning to him, she noticed that he had his hand outstretched to her with a joyful smile on his face. His dark, scruffy hair lay astray as if he had just come from slumber himself. Vivid green eyes stared through the black bangs. She stared down at his outstretched hand and realized he was wearing a clean and pressed tuxedo. Gazing at him queerly, she wondered why he would wear such formal clothing in the forest. This was quickly dismissed when she met his gorgeous eyes again, and the questions left her mind. "Where am I?" she asked in a dreamy and distant voice.
Heaven on earth, Lily.
"Heaven on earth?" she inquired.
Yes.
He nudged her again for her to take notice. She looked to his hand, then back to his eyes as he made the same motion with that smile that made her feel quite right at home. The home inside of herself, but also with the outside world too. When she took his hand in hers, she instantly flinched away from it. Staring down at the hand that appeared so warm and soft was surprisingly icy cold. "Why are you so cold?" she asked.
I've been outside all night waiting on you, Lily. It was cold.
"Why didn't you come in with me?"
You didn't let me in.
He said, but his words had no trace of resentment in them. "Oh," she said softly. I'm sorry."
It's okay, Lily. I won't be so cold now.
He smiled. She took his hand in hers. It was just as cold, but she took it upon herself to make them warm again. "Thank you for waiting on me. I'm sorry."
Don't be sorry, love. It's okay. We're together now. Follow me. I have something to show you.
He led her in the direction of the clearing where the air sparkled like magic. Drawing back the limbs of the bushes, she found it surprisingly how soft they were. There did not seem to be any harsh bark or sharp edges, as the feathery pine needles grazed across her skin. Emerging through the thicket of brush, a clearing came into view to display a strikingly beautiful pond that bore crystal clear water. Brightly colored fish could be seen swimming gracefully along the fern-like vegetation that swayed in the ripples that their tiny fins created as they passed by. Across the pond, several white silken blankets were laid out on the mossy ground. Silvery dishes sat upon the satin sheets, gleaming crisp clean in the sunlight that made its way through the overhead trees. Though she held fast to his hand, it did not seem as though it was getting any warmer, but she could feel her skin growing colder. Her bare feet stepped upon the soft earth, feeling the cotton-like surface in between her toes as she stepped around the pond with him into the satin sheets. He brought her to one of the larger dishes. As he knelt down, he held his hand out to display the magnificent feast that was especially for her. "For me?" she squeaked. It was far and few between that she was given something of this magnitude. The seldom times that she had ever had something of this nature was always given to her at church dinners. She knew well that the dinners were not for her, but the entirety of the church. It was still more than she had received elsewhere. Nevertheless, she was grateful for his kindness and had no words to express her appreciation. He merely smiled in response. She knelt down beside him and realized she was no longer in her ragged jeans and her tired t-shirt that she had worn out here. It was then she realized she was barefoot, though she had tread upon mossy surface but a moment ago. Now she found herself in a solid white gown that draped over her body perfectly. Though she did not recall changing, it was quickly dismissed at the sight of what was inside of the dish before her. Inside of the glamorous silver dish sat what looked like raspberry cobbler. Her hands were over her mouth in an instant as she let out a small gasp of awe. Turning to him with such surprise that something this excellent would be given to her, she could not fathom what she must have done to deserve this. She glanced around for silverware or plasticware, but didn't see any laying around and looked at him with curiosity.
I'm so sorry, Lily. I did not have any to spare. You can dig in using your hands. I shall not tell a soul that you did so,
he said apologetically. She observed him for a moment to ensure that this was not a trick. When no trace of trickery could be found, she glanced back around to the steaming hot cobbler as her mouth began to water. It had been nearly a day since she had eaten. Her stomach growled at the sweet smell that wafted around her nose. A smile spread across her face as she reached her hand in and broke the soft, sweet bread surface and into the warm raspberry plump underneath. Scooping her hand through the pleasantly gooey pastry, her hand emerged with a handful of delightful treat. Shoveling her hand into her mouth and licking her fingers with the sugary warmth, her stomach cried for more. Raspberry puree poured down her chin with each mouthful as she smacked and chewed on the sticky goodness. Before she knew it, she had consumed nearly half the cobbler when her appetite had caught up with her brain. Leaning herself back against the tree, she licked the remaining delicious tart from her hand before letting out a sigh of content. As she turned to him, she noticed that he had been sitting there the entire time watching her eat without taking a single bite himself. Did you not want any?" she asked. He shook his head while the pleasant smile remained on his adorable face.
Why don't we take a wash in the pond, Lily?
He offered. Peering to the pond, it welcomed her with its glistening crystal-clear glass and told her that she could not have only a wash but a refreshing drink as well. Nodding in agreement, she stood with him as they trotted to the small watering hole together. Coming to the edge of the pond, she slowly dipped her toes in and realized the water was fairly warm. It felt soothing to her chilly skin, despite the warm meal she just had.
Shall we?
He gestured. You're wearing formal clothes. Won't you ruin them?
Nonsense. This water is too pure to ruin my attire.
Recalling her silken white dress, she wondered if hers would be ruined, and thought of how she would be scalded if she were to do such a thing in this nice article of clothing.
It shall not.
He responded to her voiceless inquiry. He set foot into the pond and slowly backed in until he was submerged up to his neck in the center of the watering hole.
Come, Lily. The water's fine.
She glanced at her dress once more before slipping her foot through the waters, watching the colorful array of fish scatter. Feathery ferns whisked across her leg and slow danced in the ripples. He was right. The water was indeed very fine. She continued on until she was only a mere foot away from him. He smiled and held his hand out when she noticed something strange. Though both of his hands had been submerged in the water, one emerged with not a single trace of dampness in the sleeve of his wares. No water dripped from his outstretched hand either. Her eyes glanced up to him with distrust.
Why do you look at me in such a way? The water is pure, Lily. It is not water that you are familiar with.
She brought her hand up from the water and watched her hand steadily drip while his remained dry. Peering back to him with suspicion, he smiled at her response.
We merely need to cleanse you of your worldly contamination, and then you will be as I.
Suddenly, the warm water went ice cold, and the sparkling wonder in the air around the pond had turned into the dead of night, with only the moonlight to shine upon them both in the center of the watering hole. Peering down at the swaying weeds in the water, she noticed that these were no plants at all. It was hair. Hair on the head of a human. And not just any human, but... She gaped at the solid white face that stared back at her with glassy distant eyes, open but never seeing. Her long brown hair slowly danced through the waters and wrapped slowly around her thin legs. It was then that she knew that this was not just her reflection. It was her. Jumping in the water, she jerked around trying to free herself as her hair tangled around her ankles and clung tightly to her skin. She looked up to him with fear in her eyes as she saw his hand still outstretched to her, but the soft, fair skin had turned into the shadow she recalled now and had forgotten of. Its large, glowing orb stared back at her in the same calm expression. She shook her head quickly as terror leaped into her throat as she screamed. The scream scratched her throat painfully as it escaped. It had been many months and perhaps years since she had screamed like this. A beating would always follow such a thing. But a beating never crossed her mind as her cry pierced through the chilly night, echoing through the eerie silence. The only thing within her mind that came close to forming a legible word in her mind was flee. Reaching into the water, she took hold of the hair around her leg and tore it from her as she bounded out of the pond. Breathing heavily, she crawled to the edge and grabbed at the grass along the shore as she hoisted herself onto solid ground, but ensured to put several feet between her before looking back. As she did, she saw him at the center of the pond now, but several young girls still stood as their eldritch eyes watched her. Tearing her eyes from them, she could see the silvery dishes full of cobbler was not tart at all. Where she had sat next to one of the trees and consumed nearly half of a delicious treat, lay the carcass of a deer that had been dead for quite some time. The bloated belly had popped and its intestines around it hung open. It appeared like something had recently dug into the corpse. Small dark footprints could be seen at the animal and faced the direction of the pond, leading down to it. Frightened eyes peered down to find that the surprisingly white dress, rather than normal attire she had worn outside, was covered in blood. Her stomach twisted violently as she began heaving the innards back up that had been consumed and splattered around her legs and feet. Her muscles constricted and contracted, but forced herself to begin running as she continued to heave hot, rotting meat on her frigid skin. Her feet protested against the hard, rocky forest floor, feeling cuts and scrapes forming as she bolted through the trees. The fresh wounds grinding dirt and debris into them with each footfall stung immensely, but she forced her legs to keep moving. She had not a clue if she were running in the direction of her home or not, anywhere but here. The vomiting had ceased, but she dared not stop. Forgetting her items in the cave, she ran as fast as her little tired legs could carry her as a voice reached her ears.
Lily, just let me in.
As she ran, she pushed her hands out in front of her, bursting through the thicket as she came to a sudden halt and slid on the wet pine needles on the damp floor. The pond was before her again, as if she had just run into a full circle back into the shadow, and the little girls chanted in unison, "Just let me in. Just let me in." Taking off around the pond and back again in what she knew was for sure the right direction, or at least the opposite of the direction of the pond, she screamed. She ran faster as she ignored the pain in her feet and her legs, crying out into the darkness. Whispers all around her continued their ominous chant.
Help me! Please, save me!
Just let me in.
The opening came into view again as she came to another halt. He stood now on the edge of the pond while the girls remained in the water, as he said it in his melodiously haunting voice.
Everything that you have wanted and more. It is the magic stories that you've been told. Under my control, you are safe in the unknown. Just let me in.
Shoving past him, she sprinted around the pond as she screamed again. Stumbling through the dark limbs and branches, she came to the opening again. He was closer now than the last, where the pond lay eerily still, lit by only the moonlight, while the dead stood just as still as the water, watching her.
No!
She cried as she ran again. From behind, she could hear him say,
Follow wherever I go. I can give you everything you've been dreaming of. Just let me in.
Again and again she ran, crying out for help. Each time he drew closer to her as she tried to get away. But no matter what direction she ran in, she came back to the pond every time.
Please, help me!
She again ran through the thicket and pushed her way through as she ran straight into his outstretched arms. Closing around her as she screamed, everything went black, and all she could hear him say,
Let me in.